refueling ports are very, very, very cheap. So it seems to me we need to start to think about that and not find ourselves in the mid-30s having locked ourselves into or backed ourselves into a corner where we can't do something that maybe an adversary is already doing.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. Today we have another episode in our Future Forward series. We're talking about dynamic space operations, or DSO. Other episodes in the series include things like addressing vulnerabilities in the supply chain, applying artificial intelligence to space, streamlining mission authorization, planning the science for Mars now for when humans get there, and even explaining the who's who in the European space sector. All of our shows are available on YouTube and by podcast and at csps.aerospace.org. Today, our own policy analyst, Katherine Melbourne, talks about DSO, dynamic space operations, with guests Bryan Hoke, he's a technical fellow at the Aerospace Corporation, and John Shaw, U.S. Space Force retired. He's also former deputy commander of U.S. Spacecom. So space has been included in warfare easily since the 1990s. But today we see a shift from simply informing the battlefield to space becoming the battlefield. The reality of maneuverable satellites by our competitors necessitates that the U.S. consider how to best protect and defend our assets there. What does this mean? And what are the considerations to make it successful? Well, you can watch or listen now to find out. Let's go over to Katie and our guests.
Thank you so much, Colleen. I am so thrilled to be here with General Shaw and Bryan Hoke from Aerospace. I know that we've had General Shaw on the show before, but I believe this is Bryan's first show, and I can't wait for the conversation between these two experts. So, General Shaw, I will start with you. I know that you've gone over this before with us, but in 2023, you wrote a paper that coined the term dynamic space operations, or DSO as we'll call it. Can you walk us through the origins of this term and how it relates to space security?
Hey, sure, Katie. But first, let me say, hey, Colleen, thanks for the introduction, and Katie, good to be with you here today. And thanks for having Bryan on this as well. He and I we served together in uniform, and I don't think he can tell you everything he did when he was in uniform, but it's just great to have him here as well, and he's doing some great things with aerospace. So Bryan, great to have you on the
Great to be here. Thanks.
Hey, so I think to answer your question, Katie, I'd say it's almost more, I find it's more helpful to talk about what a DSO is not as a reference point. And so really I sort of started to develop the idea when we were at Space Command, and we were trying to do some things with some of our capabilities, and we kept getting the answer back, well, we don't have enough fuel, or we have to extend the lifetime because the satellite won't be replaced until whatever year. And then I kept thinking about why have we designed it this way? Why did we do this? And so I actually came up with the term positional space operations before I came up with dynamic space operations. And that was a way to describe how we kind of designed our satellite architectures from the very beginning. You know, we have the wonderful gift that Kepler gave us of being able to put satellites in constant energy orbits, which is what we do, right? We largely put them in an energy static orbit, and we leave it there, or we leave a constellation there, and a lot of the fuel is used to actually keep it in that position. And we actually designed some of our satellites. I talk about RG-1 a lot as one of them, along this kind of paradigm, right? We're going to launch it. It's going to have all the fuel it needs for its lifetime. It's got to last several years. And as I started to kind of think about, like, wait, why are we doing it that way? We're doing it wrong. We should be thinking about which missions need to be positional. In much way, we would think on the land domain, what sort of things do I need to be stationary capabilities, like radio towers or cell towers or logistics depots, and what kind of things probably need to be looked at differently. And so that's really what started the thinking along those lines in that paper, which I had a couple co-authors, by the way, from aerospace that were very helpful to me on putting that together. But it started a conversation of, hey, if we thought about this differently, how did things change? And it starts immediately with platforms. But I think, as we'll talk about here in our time together, it rapidly expands to architectures, designs, logistics, and so on. And it can become infectious once you start really thinking about it.
That completely makes sense with the background in positional operations, and I really like that turn of phrase. I'm curious why 2023? Like what was the turning point and the impetus of that paper at the time?
Just to recover the history, the paper I think came out at the end of 2023, but the first major talk I gave at it was in Space Symposium in 2023, and I think that's still on YouTube somewhere. And that's where we really kind of introduced from U.S. Space Command perspective, hey, here's where we think we need to be going in the future. And 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 I could talk publicly about RG1, also known as Geosynchronous Space Situation Awareness Program. GSAP is its old name. Some people may remember it that way. I could talk openly about that, but it could reference any kind of platform that U.S. Space Command may be trying to operate within the space domain that has an in-domain mission, right? It doesn't have to be looking down at the Earth and be part of a static constellation providing support or space enabling capabilities down to Earth. It's operating in the domain. Why would you operate a platform like that in a positional manner or near positional manner with very, very little ability to maneuver and to do things that can keep an adversary off balance? That was really kind of the genesis of it. And it was a real world issue we were looking at. We were trying to use, as I talked publicly, the RG1s to take a good look at what others were doing in space, particularly China. And as we put together our list of priorities of what we wanted those to do, when the planners came back, they could only do a small fraction of them. It became increasingly frustrating to me as the deputy commander of Space Command, and started again that idea of, hey, how do we think about this differently? So it's been about 3 years now since that, and there's been a lot of discussion and thought put into it from a lot of different organizations, aerospace being one of them, and Bryan being one of those people at the tip of the spear for aerospace, thinking about dynamic space operations.
Yeah, that's a great transition. Bryan, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've been doing with aerospace regarding DSO?
Sure. Yeah, first of all, thanks for being here to Colleen and the Space Policy Show and you, Katie. It's a real privilege for me to be here with General Shaw, who was an inspiration and mentor to me in my Air Force career. So, DSO, General Shaw coined the term, and it's largely been used to mean the sustained space maneuver, or SSM, part of the problem. And that is, the biggest, most important part of dynamic space operations. There are other parts that we in aerospace are sort of trying to flesh out the bubble and think through some of the other ways that you can achieve dynamism. And I sort of am thinking of it as, anything that increases our ability to operate frequently, quickly, at as many points in space as we can, and maybe most importantly, to do that in a sustained way through competition, crisis, and conflict, right? So that's a pretty broad definition. Clearly, orbital maneuver and sustained space maneuver are the most fundamental part of that. We'll get more into what aerospace is doing and thinking along those lines, but there are other aspects to DSO which we should be thinking about too. Things like how you use the radiomagnetic or electroradiomagnetic spectrum, how you do dynamic operations and tasking, how you can even reconfigure spacecraft or use them in unexpected ways. And there's a lot of other areas that sort of fill in around and complete the area of dynamic space operations that we're trying to explore, but all sort of based on and predicated the initial thought leadership that General Shaw and a few others did at Space Command. So it's an exciting time to think through these problems.
Absolutely. I agree. And there's so many different facets to acting dynamically in space as you captured. So what I'm hearing are themes of freeing up the decision space for planners and people who are thinking about threats in space, as well as being adaptable, flexible, and resilient on orbit. Is this does DSO then mean a set of architectures, as you mentioned earlier, General Shaw, a set of technologies? What does it mean in a few sentences to you in its simplest form? I'll start with General Shaw, but Bryan, I'd like you to answer as well.
I think it starts with the realization is if you start to think about this differently, how do it becomes a compounding effect? How do a lot of other things change? So if you continue with the sort of a positional space operations approach, you're going to build your satellite to be self-contained. Its command and control system might be dedicated to just that satellite. And even the satellites itself, its design, it'll have a large fuel tank. It'll probably have, this is the way we've designed our satellites because we're so fuel constrained, we design very small thrusters with very little thrust. Imagine if you had a vehicle on Earth that you couldn't refill the gas tank. What would be the point of an 8-cylinder engine? You'd probably have a 1-cylinder engine. That's how we build our spacecraft today. If you're freed from all that, if you kind of redesign anything in the architecture, including the satellite itself, and you now have the ability to, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of consumables, servicing and such. Now designs become much more interesting. I don't need as large a fuel tank. I don't have to even launch the fuel tank full. I can make the satellite smaller and perhaps more nimble. I can actually give it a larger thruster to afford me more thrust when I want it. I can put it in afterburner rather than in the lowest possible speed. And that's just how I think the beginning of how things change. You made your question more about architectures. It's now how do a lot of pieces now work in concert together as opposed to just a redesigned kind of platform to enable space superiority.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that really, the way I try to think about this is that the truth is none of us, even General Shaw, none of us and no one in the world has really engaged in conflict in space, right? And in all the other domains, we have centuries or even millennia of experiential learning and evidence to support how we're designing our architectures and a lot of lessons learned on how to operate them and the lessons learned of sustained logistics and flexibility and et cetera. In space, I think what we really need to be concentrating on in light of that is flexibility. And we don't know how the conflict is going to go. We don't know what the adversaries are going to do. We don't know how that's going to play out. And I think most importantly, that means we don't know which of our assumptions about the way we're going to operate that conflict are going to be held or come to fruition in an actual conflict. And so flexibility, I think, is important. We can't just rely on launch. We need to have the ability to practice our maneuvers, our operations in space. And I think a very important part of this is designing in all the possible flexibilities that we can afford. And the combination of those flexibilities will be what allow us to adapt to an uncertain environment, adapt to an uncertain adversary. And, even if the conflict goes 3 times as long as we've planned for, or we're not as effective as we would have liked to have been, having these flexibilities built in will give us the ability to adapt. And that's, sort of the American way of war in my thinking. And there's so many things that we can be looking at to do to increase that flexibility. And the sustained space maneuver is obviously one of them, right? We didn't invent the afterburner because, as General Shaw just pointed out, we didn't invent the afterburner because we had a very specific point case that we optimized the design of the afterburner to meet a very specific engagement for one platform against one platform, right? We did it so the pilot has flexibility to do what they need to do when they need to do it. And those are the kinds of modes of thinking we need to be thinking of both in satellite design, but also constellation design and the way we command and control those constellations and et cetera.
Hey, Kay, let me pile on to what Bryan said. I think one of the pitfalls or dangers of continuing purely positional space operations is it's really an attritional approach, right? If you're not maneuvering them, you're kind of operating in a static environment. And maybe, there's it's good to have lots of platforms and resilience and that you get from proliferation, but it's still static. And so it still becomes an attrition fight if you have a fight in space. Now, if you're up against an adversary who also is operating positionally, it's probably this massive attrition where we're each trying to take out each other's capabilities. They kind of degrade, and there's no decisive effect probably. If one of those adversaries has the ability to significantly operate dynamically in the face of the other who's operating positionally, that never bodes well in any other domains. It probably doesn't bode well in the space domain. If both adversaries have the ability to operate dynamically, now it becomes really who can do it better. And so many analogies we've seen in the other domains along these lines of maneuver on the battlefield or in the maritime environment I think we're going to see those play out in the space domain.
Yeah, I absolutely hear what you're saying about the evolution of the different technologies and the different ways that we are implementing this in response to and ahead of the evolving threats. And so keeping that flexibility is very important. So I'm kind of curious what ways you've seen us acting more dynamically in space. Have there been examples of us doing more maneuvers on orbit in the last few years since we've talked? That we
Yeah,
can talk about?
I think we're probably haven't made much progress on actual material solutions, right? And there's the most vocal voice, the loudest voice in this discussion has been U.S. Space Command. General Whiting has spoken about it repeatedly. A lot of his staff talk about it because they're there every day trying to, um, you know, conduct operations in the space domain. They see the constraints we're running up against. They see what China is doing. And so we haven't really done much on the material solution side. We have done some thinking about it. And how do we operate in the ways that Bryan talks about? How do we operate more dynamically, more in concert, not only among all of our space capabilities, but also in concert with terrestrial forces, which is important as well. So, but I still feel we're only in the very beginning of unlocking the capabilities that will be needed.
So let's talk about some of those trades. Bryan, I saw that you seem to be excited to talk. So I want to turn to you and think through, okay, so we've established that maneuver is a really big part of DSO and that we're still working on this capability. So what do you see as the different options for enabling the sustainment of maneuver in space?
Yeah, there's a few. I want to go back to the previous question just very quickly because you asked what has changed in the domain since the last time you spoke to General Shaw, which I think was 2 or 3 years ago. I'll just mention briefly and in no detail, one thing that keeps changing is the landscape of the adversary in this area right there. And I can't go into detail, but they certainly aren't sitting still. And it's clear that they're thinking along these lines. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? And how does that compare to what we're doing? And where will we match up when it really matters? And so just one addition to the what's changed question. And in terms of the different ways to achieve sustained space maneuver question, I'll mention a couple of things here, but I want to point out that, it's never one or the other, right? What we really need to be doing is, in my opinion, is designing as many flexibilities as we can to, again, as I pointed out, be resilient to an uncertain future on how the space domain is going to play out. And so I think that having all of these kinds of capabilities in different measures and in different levels and used in different ways is going to be important. But when I think of sustained space maneuver specifically, I think of the potential of 3, possibly 4 ways that you could achieve what I'll call, and this is another term that General Shaw created, the ability to maneuver without regret, which means that you can do as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and not have to have that psychology in your head that you're going to be out of fuel later and you don't know what's coming, right? So a few ways to do that. One is clearly refueling and reuse of spacecraft. And I think that's really important. There clearly is a lot of cost involved in the spacecraft that we're fielding and a lot of capability. And we've seen comments recently to the effect of, that we need to understand the cost proposition or the military utility of some of these things. Well, I would like to see the cost proposition that, replacing fuel on orbit is more expensive than replacing satellites and fuel on orbit, right? And I think that that's not certain. So that's something that refueling and reuse certainly needs to be something that we're looking at. The other path is to replace satellites after you use the fuel that's in them. And there's some benefit to that, or there's some potential benefits to that, I should say. There's a general theme that launch costs are coming down and satellites are proliferating, and maybe we can launch more of those. I think there's also a number of things that need to be thought through with that kind of decision-making process. And if we really are going to launch our way into a situation of maneuver without regret, that we need to think about what that really means. Do we need to be, overproducing and storing boosters? Do we need to be overproducing and storing satellites? Do we need to be hardening our launch bases if we get into a contested environment? Do we need to be storing and prepositioning consumables to launch those rockets? Do we need to have all these satellites ready to mate, right? And there's a lot of things here that it would take to make a launch our way out of the problem solution real. And I think that those costs are also unassessed at this point. And then the other kind of ways I can think of to do this is if you pre-positioned a large number of on-orbit spares sort of in peacetime that you would then use in wartime, and instead of replenishing from the ground, you replenish from space. I think there's interesting ideas there. Certainly there are other domains that have prepositioned spares as a concept, but now you need to think about things about, like, what if the conflict doesn't happen until 10 years from now? How many times have we had to replace our replacements, so that we have, you can envision a situation to get through a long conflict. You might have to have 3 or 4 times the architecture that you think you need to actually win the conflict as pre-positioned on-orbit spares. And so have we really assessed the cost and value proposition of those? The last thing, there's other concepts like high thrust jet packs and other things that you could use to add maneuver capability. So, the message here is that there's a big trade space here. I think the ideal answer will inevitably be a combination of all of these. And there is an analytical gap, which you've heard some senior leaders talk about in recent events, in interviews and et cetera, on how to assess all these different things. And that is specifically what I'm working on in aerospace, is trying to cobble together a set of tools and workflows to more deliberately work through some of those analyses so we can come to answers that make sense. So that was a pretty long answer. There's a lot there. I think, in summary, the other domains have combinations of our, force structure and refueling and reuse and prepositioned spares and manufacturing and et cetera. And we just need to figure out what that looks like for space. But I think that it would be a real leap of faith to think that we don't need aspects of all of those to be successful in this domain like we are in the others.
So there's a lot in what Bryan just said there. We could probably spend a couple days unpacking all that. Here, let me read back how I kind of heard what he said, maybe, and for a little more color. So maneuver, you shouldn't equate wanting sustained maneuver with refueling, right? We can do it a number of ways. The base problem I had at U.S. Space Command is that I couldn't use RG-1s as aggressively as I wanted to. If we used them aggressively and used up all their fuel, I just need another one, right? And that's a solution for some of these space maneuver, sustained maneuver solutions, is to have commoditization, is a rapid replenishment of probably a relatively simple platform. And this looks a little bit like drone warfare probably looks today, right? Just think about it as proliferation, commoditization of platforms. But I'd be very skeptical that that's the sole solution to the sustained maneuver problem. Those would be relatively simple Drones are relatively simple. The more complex your platform gets, and the further away from the bottom of the gravity well you want to operate, the more likely you're going to probably want a reusable platform rather than a commoditized one. I just don't see us replenishing. I did some math, right? I figured out that if we could use RG1s as aggressively as we wanted to in today's conditions, not tomorrow's conditions, we'd probably use up their fuel 20 times faster than we're doing today. That's a massive capability gap. How do you close that gap? You want to launch 20 times as many? That's one possible solution. But some of our platforms that operating doing space superiority are going to have to be a little more complicated than something that, and the cost curves are not going to close. And we need to look at all of these possible solutions. I used to say I was actually skeptical about a refueling solution in low Earth orbit because of the tyranny of angular momentum that you get in low Earth orbit, right? That made sense to me. Why Starlink does what it does. Proliferate simple satellites in low Earth orbit, very hard to service because you have to be in that exact plane and such. I actually think I'm wrong. I think if we start to see orbital data centers in space in low Earth orbit, those are going to be pretty complex platforms. They're not going to be simple Starlink platforms. Those are going to be complex platforms. And I believe that you'll actually see servicers launched into the same planes as a string of those platforms to service them over their lifetime. I think we'd actually see that. So even my kind of supposition was wrong about the potential for servicing even in low Earth orbit, let alone in the much more in the further reaches where you have much more flexibility and maneuverability with additional fuel. So it's just there's so much to unlock and how to do this. And I think in the end, I think Brian's right. It's going to be a combination of a lot of these things. We'll proliferate, but if we proliferate, we got to look at the logistics and sustainment stream for that on Earth or on orbit or whatever. If we're going to service more complex platforms operating further out, that's another kind of logistics architecture. And then I go back to what we talked about, the design of all those platforms optimized for that sustainment architecture becomes something that opens up a lot of possibilities.
I love this answer because I think you both captured just how hard it is to wrap your head around how to solve this problem. But what's heartening is that there's seems to be a lot of technologies and potential solutions when used in concert with each other, we can actually make progress. I'm going to pull on a few things that you said here and poke at them. So you mentioned earlier, I believe General Shaw, you mentioned this, not all systems require maneuver. And then we also talked about how enabling more maneuver may require a paradigm shift in how we design satellites or design certain systems. So the combination of this is going to end up in some sort of maneuver enabling architecture or infrastructure that includes the commoditization piece and includes the refueling piece. So how do you see this evolution happening? I know of one example of the next generation of RG satellites, including a requirement for interoperable fueling ports. That's one example, but that's a singular system. Do you see how do you see the evolution towards an overarching infrastructure, if there's going to be one for enabling maneuver?
Well, we have to do a lot of things. We have to probably ramp up our demonstrations of being able to do this. We know how to refuel in orbit. We did with Orbital Express well over a decade ago. We know how to do that. But there are some demos that are coming and that are paid for, and I think those are going to help us understand how to do a little bit better, use modern zero proximity operations is what we call when two satellites come very, very, very close together to do that in a more modern fashion and autonomously to some extent. But we need to start thinking about future architectures now and what those look like. For me, it seems to me a no-brainer to put at least refueling ports on pretty much all of our satellites that were not just the RGs in the in-domain, but even missile warning satellites that might not maneuver a whole lot. Refueling ports are very, very, very cheap. So it seems to me we need to start to think about that and not find ourselves in the mid-30s having locked ourselves into or backed ourselves into a corner where we can't do something that maybe an adversary is already doing.
Yeah, I'll just expand on that. And it goes to what I said earlier about we need to be designing flexibility in, to deal with problems that we don't fully understand yet. And if there are simple things we can do to add flexibility, it's hard for me to argue that those aren't worthwhile things. And we've seen and I have full confidence, in Space Force operators, right? If you give them flexibility, they'll figure out how to use it and maybe, achieve effects you never thought possible, right? But if they don't have the flexibilities, they can't do it. There's a couple of other things we need to be thinking about in order to make this kind of thing work. One is that, we don't even, much less refueling for, we don't even have standard fuel necessarily for all of our systems, right? And so there's things that I think the government needs to grapple with that aren't inherently commercial, like figuring out fuel standards and interface standards and some of these things that would enable some of these ecosystems, which are pretty important to do. As General Shaw mentioned, there's some demos coming. There's more sort of in the conception phase. I think those are good. I also think that we need to be moving pretty fast and pretty architecturally to introduce flexibilities, and we may need to accelerate the pace of some of those. And I'm not just talking about refueling. There's technologies, as I mentioned, with launch on demand and pre-positioned architectures. Do we need hangars on orbit that keep the lifetime of the satellites in the hangar from, keep them from being exposed to the space environment, which is pretty harsh, especially at higher altitudes? Do we need hangars that keep the satellites inside them from being exposed to that environment so that when you hatch those satellites and need to use them, they have their full lifetime, right? There's a number of things we need to be looking at in all of these different sort of solution spaces that, again, add up to add flexibility in the way you operate, the way you reconstitute forces. Another thing I'll mention is the very strong historical analogy, or not analogy, I say lessons learned, that so the shorter the supply lines are and the more defendable they are, generally speaking, the more successful those supply lines are. And General Whiting mentioned in one of his recent speeches that the supply line from the Earth to geosynchronous orbit would be the longest supply line in the history of the world. Of course, some of that is just because the space is big, but there's other things to think about too, right? If our supply line depends on reconstituting individual spacecraft, that supply line potentially goes through what we call the POM process, or the process where you ask for money from the Department of War, who asks for money from the executive branch, who asks for money from Congress, and you could get to a supply line that is potentially literally years long unless we architect the right way. And so there's a lot of considerations in some of these solutions, and really a lot to think through to make them work.
Thank you for getting into that extra piece of it with the actual acquisition process a little bit. So Bryan, we've talked about aerospace's approach to dealing with some of these trades. General Shaw, I was wondering if you have any insight into how Space Command is seeing these trades and where Space Force plays into that as well.
Well, again, I think what you're continuing to hear from Space Command, I mean, when I was there in active duty, we were talking about it, but you're continuing to hear about it now, is anticipating the future and a potential adversary who might be operating dynamically, and the need to be able to keep pace or actually stay ahead if we really want to sustain space superiority in the future. We can add a little bit more detail. So last year, China conducted. They did a docking maneuver between their SJ-21 and SJ-25 platforms. And soon after that docking maneuver, both of those platforms together performed the largest single maneuver ever observed in geosynchronous orbit, ever attempted, ever observed, ever seen, well over 300 meters per second. That's just an example of what Bryan was talking to earlier, things that we're seeing China do. And that one was observed by amateur astronomers everywhere. And I talked about it in a congressional testimony last fall of an example. So we're seeing them do that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that is important to point out. So given all this, is there a difference in how we are going to be approaching maneuver and dynamic space operations more broadly in a contested peacetime environment compared to in a conflict? Bryan, I'll start with you.
Well, so the very short answer is I don't think there should be a difference because in both peacetime and conflict, I think we collectively want to get to a state where we can maneuver without regret, right? And so this is a great point because one thing that struck me is that, and yeah, and you've seen senior leaders say this repeatedly. If you read Space Force Doctrine Document 1, it's several times in the first few pages that, and I'm paraphrasing, but the mission of the Space Force is to deter conflict in, through, and from space, and then obviously if that conflict happens, to be prepared to win it. But I think we need to be talking more about the peacetime or competition phase part of this and what it means to deter. And I think that there's aspects of credibility and aspects of being able to maneuver without regret during peacetime to do things like train and test and exercise and potentially posture your forces. And then if the tensions dwindle, withdraw, posture, withdraw, train, exercise, right? And there's potentially a great deal of dynamic operations that should be happening in peacetime, which may last years and years and years. And we aren't really postured to do that right now because of some of the things General Shaw has highlighted in the past with, we maneuver with regret now. And so just like before, there's potentially different ways to, solve that problem. I think it's a combination of all of the things we've talked about beforehand, but the ability to maneuver without regret and do all those things I mentioned, and then it's clearly important to one of the primary missions of the Space Force, which is to deter. And again, what we're looking at aerospace is trying to come up with ways to assess the relative effectiveness and costs of the different ways to do this. And I think the two of the huge parameters that need to be across that assessment space are the length of the times that are we going to be in conflict are we going to be in peacetime competition for 2 years, 6 years, 12 years? And are we going to be in conflict for a week or a month or 6 months, right? I think one thing we can say is that generally speaking, we are all very bad at anticipating exactly how long these periods go and what they're going to look like. And so we need to be able to assess the relative merits and the costs of these different approaches to fill both that peacetime and, of course, that conflict role.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. Again, let's look at other domains, right? We don't keep our U.S. Our aircraft carriers in port during peacetime and just send them out when they go to war. They're out there all the time. They're projecting power. They're doing the thing, posture withdraw. They're there as a message, as a deterrent force. But the way we kind of operate today, because we're limited positional space operations, we're kind of like in port most of the time with just a little bit of activity that's nowhere near what I think we could achieve if we could maneuver without regret. And by the way, General Bythewood talks about this. He's the Space Force component commander to U.S. Space Command, headquartered out at Vandenberg, and he talks about posture and withdraw and the ability to campaign and do things in peacetime. We could unlock so much, Katie, if we could again maneuver without regret, sustained maneuver. Before I feel like I have to get back to a cultural piece that was brought up earlier. Bryan was talking about a psychology of scarcity, right? Where we have mission planners that don't want to do anything, right? Because they have to preserve that fuel. And that kind of really constrains our ability to almost do anything, to do test and tactics development and training. And it kind of constrains the ability for lower level commanders to exercise what we call mission command, to be able to operate with flexibility and on their own, given commander's intent. They're very, very, very constrained by positional space operations. Imagine how things would change if maneuver or use of fuel or use of your platform, you were encouraged to use it as aggressively as you possibly could, as opposed to as conservatively as you possibly could. Imagine what that would unlock in terms of new tactics, new ideas, new ways of validating those tactics, and training personnel and just education. And that's at one end of the spectrum. And then we get into peacetime operations, what we would do, crisis operations, what we do. And then in wartime, we've already talked about it. You sure don't want to run out of fuel on day one of a conflict because you don't know how long it's going to last. And when's the next satellite going to be launched if indeed that launch base is available to you. So I guess I think that's a good thing to maybe get as we get towards the end here to focus on the cultural advantages and maybe obligations we have to future guardians or future members of U.S. Space Command to give them the tools to be the true warfighters we need them to be in space and not massively constrained as they are today.
Well, I absolutely love this conversation, and you could not have transitioned better into my final question for you. So I'll ask you both to answer briefly. What do you see is the biggest challenge to acting dynamically enough to win against an adversary in space? Is it cultural? Is it financial, technological, or something else?
Well, it's not technological. I will say that. We can do it. We can do it today. We know how to do this. And by the way, we are advancing technology faster than ever before. So we should not say that technology is the problem. The problem is going to be partially financial, and I'm hopeful that the Space Force is going to get a big plus up in its budget and can start expanding and thinking more about these broadened architectures and start going after them early now, rather than having to hoard their precious fiscal resources. I do think part of it is culture too. We need to kind of realize that we've been doing what I call space support activities that was my career, was doing space support activities from static orbits, positional space operations, driving space capabilities down to the terrestrial domains. That's still really important and is going to become even more important as days go on. You've heard so many people talk about the value of space in recent military operations for the Department of War, right? From Venezuela, Operation Midnight Hammer last year, and recent operations in Iran. Lots of leaders, even non-space leaders, talking about that. That's not going away. But we need to really kind of focus on the future. It has to be more than just that. It has to be about space superiority, to making sure that we can maneuver in the domain better than a potential adversary and that we can achieve and sustain space superiority in the face of a determined adversary in space. And I think getting that mindset in place and thinking about all the things we're going to be able to need to do that and making which leads to requirements, doctrine, tactics, force design, platforms, and platforms operating in concert in what I think Bryan likes to call a combined arms fashion, to think about it that way. That's the future. And it's so rich for thought right now. And I look forward to seeing how it unfolds.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If I had answered this question first, what the biggest challenge was, my response would have been, it's not technological, right? So very similar to what the general said, because, I think that, we've done this with Orbital Express, we've done this with the ISS. I think, we could be moving pretty fast to field a lot of this capability. And so what I'll say from my seat here at Aerospace is we are certainly perceiving that there is something of a analysis architectural barrier to sort of choosing how to proceed along these lines. I don't perceive a lot of, at least from my viewpoint, a lot of debate that getting to a state of sustained space maneuver isn't I think everyone agrees it's the right state to get to and that we ought to get there. The question is more about how, and I think we're a little bit stuck in the how. Is it, can we just proliferate and launch our way out of this? Do we need refueling? Should we look at prepositioning and jetpacks? And I think what we see is that to make any of this real, you need to have analysis that feeds, even though there's a lot of intuition and vision here that I think is pretty compelling, you need analysis to feed the infrastructure at the department level and the OMB and Congress and et cetera to justify the decisions that you want to make, especially in light of the fact that we don't have, wartime experience to inform our architecture design, right? And so I think that we're trying to help with that. I think a very important part of that analysis and architecture design is thinking about how we sustain a peacetime deterrence as well as a conflict winning design, as we mentioned before. And so I think from Aerospace's position, we really want to help break that sort of architectural and that analytical roadblock, which I think is slowing progress down. And I don't think we can afford to have slow progress on this, frankly, because it's a contested environment and it's only getting more so. And we need to be ready and we need to be moving. So hopefully we can help break that.
I would add to Brian's comments we do need some more analysis, but it's not just an analysis of what a future architecture based on sustained maneuver could get you. We should do the analysis on the vulnerabilities that positional space operations are realizing especially in the face of an adversary that can maneuver and/or has a better logistics plan than we do in a future fight. And don't get me started with the analogies of military history where there weren't enough assumptions made about the vulnerability of the current paradigm you were in against the new emerging paradigms.
Yeah, there's a lot of, if you are introducing new concepts or new, engineering or new ways of doing business, there's a tendency to say, where's the analysis? Where's the value proposition for that? I haven't seen it. I would say, I also haven't seen the value proposition for where we're at now, and that is going to be a, peacetime deterrent winning or wartime winning structure. So I think I'm just amplifying what the general said. We need to be looking at this from a broad perspective and figuring out a way forward.
Well, thank you both so much. I could keep talking to you all day, but I really appreciate that. And I am excited to continue thinking about all these hard problems and having folks like you in the field at the helm. So thank you. And back to you, Colleen.
Well, thank you, Katie, for leading us through that discussion. There's still a lot to unpack there, in my opinion. But Bryan and the General, they lay out some very real questions that must be answered if we are to realize a future of space operations that includes responsive actions to protect and secure the space domain. To our audience, I invite you to take in other shows of our Future Forward series and any of the 160 plus episodes that we've produced over the last 5 years. It's actually a very impressive archive of changes and evolution in the policy realm. As well, you can find the Center's deep research papers on important policy topics at csps.aerospace.org. And there you can subscribe to get notified. And please do follow us on social media. We would love to engage with you there. Thank you to Matthew Ricola, our technical director. And until next time, everyone, thank you for joining.